Hello. In this video, I wanted to analyze the impact of COVID-19 deaths to the overall US deaths. As you can see here, we get roughly around, by now, 68, almost 70,000 deaths in the United States for COVID-19. And I was wondering if we could see a similar impact in the overall deaths. Why is it important? Well, we've been in lockdown for 6 weeks. We still get anywhere from 22 to 34,000 cases per day. We still get anywhere from 1,300 to 2,600 deaths per day. These numbers are super high, and after 6 weeks of lockdown, it really doesn't make sense. So I figured, okay, well, let's take a look at overall deaths and see if we see the similar numbers affecting the overall deaths. Where did I get the deaths? Well, apparently there is a website provided by CDC for weekly US influenza statistics. And here there's a bunch of different things. Number one is, that's interesting to see, is, for example, overall percentage of visits for influenza-like illnesses. And we see that there was a big spike in visits in week 14 of this year that roughly corresponds to coronavirus start flare-up in the United States. There's a bunch of other things in here. The other thing that's in here is, for example, we see that there was a big spike in in this number of hospitalizations, and we see there was a big spike, for example, in 17 and 18. So again, it would be interesting to see, when we do see a big spike in hospitalizations, does it result in overall increase in deaths in the United States? And lastly, we have this chart here, and that chart is the one that started me on this journey, because here is the chart that talks about pneumonia, influenza mortality, and that's looking at the weekly deaths data. So here you can see view chart data, and if you click on that link, you'll be able to download the data set that I will be using to look at the overall US deaths. So if I were to see what's inside of the data sets, just so you guys get an idea, it's a CSV file where by week and by year we have a couple of interesting statistics: influenza deaths, which I will be analyzing later, pneumonia deaths, and most important for us right now is all deaths. So I went ahead and loaded this data into our dashboard. The link to all of this links will be provided in the description of this video, so you could get to the dashboard, play with the data yourself, get to the page and get to the data set and play with it yourself. So now let's take a look at the data. So let me introduce you to what's going on this page. I forgot to update the title in the bottom chart. It's supposed to say US deaths by week. So in the x-axis we have week 1 through week 18, which is the data set for the deaths actually ends in week 18 here, but for 2020 the latest data is for week 17. In this corner here we see the total US COVID-19 deaths. So you see that currently we stand at 66,000 deaths as of week 18. In this chart, we see the COVID-19 deaths as reported from the Johns Hopkins University public data set. So the first thing we can see is that COVID-19 is not a hoax. A lot of people are saying that this is all not true. It's not happening. Well, it is happening because I color 2020 here in pink, so that it's easier to tell apart from the rest of the years. So this is the bar for 2020, and as you can see, we have a big spike in deaths for week 14 and 15, right? So we do indeed see big spikes in deaths, and we can safely, pretty confidently attribute that to the COVID-19. The other question is, okay, we've never seen anything like this before. It's unprecedented. That claim does not seem to be true. As we can see, we do have some bars even higher than that. So on average, we see that 60,000 deaths per week is kind of the cutoff point of when there's more people dying than normal. So we could see here that in year 2018, we have 66,000 deaths in week 1. We actually went up all the way to 67,000 deaths in week 2, and then 64,000 deaths in week 3. So we actually had almost 6 weeks in 2018 when deaths were above 60,000. And you could see that significantly higher than almost any other year. So in week 14 and 15, we did see a spike in deaths in the United States. However, it was not unprecedented. It was pretty much on par with the influenza deaths that occurred in 2017-2018 flu season. Now let's see how accurate is the Johns Hopkins University dataset, or that's, I assume, is the same dataset that everybody is looking at to make their policy decisions. So let's start with week 13. Week 13, we see that we had 1,700 deaths reported for COVID-19, and in fact, we do see a small spike in deaths. So pink bar is the tallest bar over the last 5 years compared to other years. We have 57,000 deaths in week of March 22nd. In week 13, it's higher than 56,000 deaths in year 19, 54,000, roughly 55,000 18, 17, and 53.8 week year 2016. So here we say 1,700 deaths. So we would expect an average around 55,000. We got 57. So roughly 2,000 deaths more. So yes, this number makes sense. It checks out. Let's go to the next week. Week 14, 6,300 people died according to the public data set. Do we see a 6,000 death increase relative to average? Well, we see a spike, 63,000. Before we had 56, 55, so that's roughly 6,000, 6,400 more. So yes, this number checks out. We do see an increase in 6,000. Let's look into week 15. So week 15, reported number of deaths is 12,000. That's the week as of April 3rd. And then if you look at overall deaths in the US, we have 65,000 relative to 63,000. So it went up by 2,000. So let's uncheck this. We see that the difference between week 14 and week 15 is 2,000 deaths, 63 versus 65. Yet here we went from 6,000 to 12,000. So that's starting to get a little bit out of sync with the other. These two data sets start to get a little bit out of sync. So we would expect a much bigger bar here. But according to Johns Hopkins University public data set, we have 12,000 deaths in week 15, and this number is 65K. It's about 10,000 higher than normal. So the week 15 seems to be like it's overreported by 2,000 deaths, right? So on average, we see roughly 55,000 deaths in that week in the United States. We got 65,000, that's 10,000 more, not 12,000 more. Well, let's go to week 16. And now things get really interesting. So according to the public data, again, this is the data that our governors and our government is making decisions on whether we should keep the lockdown. So according to this public data set, according to this data, we're told that 18,000 people died in week 16, which would have been the second week of April when all of the public statements were saying that would have been the worst week. And according to this, it is 18,000 people died. As we said before, an average 55 to 60,000 people die per week in US. We get 18,000 die here. That's anywhere from 20 to 25% of people of all deaths in that week would have been from COVID-19. That's huge. We definitely should see a much bigger bar. However, we don't, right? So now this number here is completely nonsensical. There is no way that 18,000 people died in the United States from COVID-19. How do I know that? Well, on average, that week, 53,000 to 54,000 people die in the United States. So we expect to see 54,000 deaths. 54,000 plus 18,000 gets us to 72,000 deaths, right? So on average we get 54, we got extra of 18,000 from COVID, so this bar should be 72,000. In reality, not only is it not 72,000, so it's not even taller than average. So on one hand, we're being told that week 16 we had the biggest number of COVID-19 deaths, while overall number of deaths in the United States shrunk in 2020 relative to prior 4 years. We had fewer deaths in week 16 in 2020 than we had in prior 4 years, even though we're told that 18,000 people died from COVID-19 that week. This is a crazy, unsubstantiated number that makes no sense, and anybody who wants to make any policy decisions based on that number is making a big mistake. I'm gonna click on week 17. This data set is as of week 17, 2020. Clearly there is some sort of data issue, right? So according to official data, we have 15,000 deaths in week 17. So if we're getting an average 53,000, 53 plus 15, we should be roughly at 68, almost 70,000 deaths. The number of deaths reported is 24,000. I assume it's an incomplete data set, so I cannot wait until next week when this data set is updated, so we can take a look at this week in more detail. If we see the same dynamic in week 17 that we see in 16, so in 16, 18,000 reported, but overall deaths are less than the prior 4 years, this number is a complete insanity and it's fraud. And then if you look at 17, we will see what that number is. If that number is not taller than prior 4 years, again, we have to take a really, really serious look into quality of this data. To summarize, we were able to validate deaths from week 13, 14, and with a bit of a stretch, week 15, right? So week 15 reported as 12,000. We're able to find 10. So, but starting from week 15, all the numbers become not very reliable. In fact, I would say they're completely bogus. To make any sort of policy decisions based on deaths, lockdowns, or any sort of policy decisions for COVID-19 based on numbers starting the April 10th and after that, that would be a huge, huge mistake. So, is COVID-19 real? Yes, it's real. Are the numbers for COVID-19 meaningful or meaningless? They certainly seemed pretty meaningful for the first several weeks, until the end of March and maybe first week of April. But everything we see for deaths right now has completely no basis in reality. Again, I will post all of the links to the dashboard, CDC page, and the CDC dataset in the description of this video. Hope you found this video helpful and maybe even entertaining. And please come again for more videos in the future. Thanks. Bye.